Hello, talo falava, 안녕하세요, and welcome to our town hall talk, Demystifying Political Advocacy. Thank you for joining us. So we are hosting this town hall talk on the traditional land of the first people of Kent, the Muckleshoot people past and present, and we honor with gratitude the land itself and the Muckleshoot tribe. It is important to note that this kind of land acknowledgement is not a new practice developed by colonial institutions. Land acknowledgement is a traditional custom dating back centuries for many Native communities and nations. For non-Indigenous communities, land acknowledgement is a powerful way of showing respect and honoring the Indigenous peoples of the land on which we work and live. Acknowledgement is a simple way of resisting the erasure of Indigenous histories and working towards honoring and inviting the truth. So now I'd like to take a moment to welcome our featured panelist. Chelsea Moore is the director of Look to Justice. She is also a lecturer of law and society at the University of Washington and the Justice Policy Manager for Dream.org, a national nonprofit. She holds a PhD in political science from the University of Washington with a focus on the criminal legal system. Chelsea sits on the Korematsu Race and Criminal Justice Task Force. She is a published researcher, an award-winning instructor, and a member of the Pi Beta Kappa Honor Society. In 2020, she was named an American Association of University Women Dissertation Fellow. Chelsea and her husband, Christopher Blackwell, who is incarcerated at the Washington Corrections Center, co-founded Look to Justice. Welcome, Chelsea. Thanks for being here, Chelsea. Hi.
Hello. Thanks for having me.
Of course. Thanks so much for being here. For our audience watching, feel free to ask questions in the chat, and we'll do our best to relay them to Chelsea. Chelsea, I'll hand it over to you to lead our presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all so much for joining tonight. It's really great to be with you. So today we're going to talk about demystifying political advocacy and particularly understanding how a bill becomes law, which I know a lot of us think about like the school rock song about the bill sitting on Capitol Hill. It's as easy as that, but it's also very complicated, and it's also intentionally made very complicated and opaque to keep people out of political participation. And so my hope is today to just kind of walk you through that. And again, super happy to make this conversational. So if you all have any questions, feel free to pop them in the chat, and I can answer them in real time. And then we can also answer questions at the end. So definitely feel free to pop in with any questions. So first, Suyong gave me a really nice introduction, so thank you for that. I want to talk a little bit first about some of the advocacy that I've been working on in Olympia and some of the bills that I've been working on. And then we'll jump into the overview of how a bill becomes law and understanding important points in how a bill becomes law so that we can be prepared for this upcoming legislative session. So just quickly, so Look to Justice is an organization that believes that the people who are closest to the problem are in the best position to know the solutions, but don't have access a lot of times to the resources. And so we do a lot of civic engagement and political education for folks who are justice involved, who are impacted by the criminal punishment system, and particularly incarcerated folks. And we've been working on two really important bills. As y'all might know, Washington State abolished parole in 1984. And so we're one of a handful of states that has no parole, that everyone does almost the exact amount of time that they're sentenced to. So one bill that we've been working on would expand parole eligibility to anyone who was given a lifelong sentence before the age of 25. Because our brains aren't fully done baking until the age of 25 or even beyond. And then the other bill would eliminate the practice of automatically giving people longer sentences for crimes that they committed as children. So I just wanted to throw that out there, that that's what we've been working on. So just a general overview of our legislature. So we have a bicameral legislature. That means there are two chambers. They're called chambers. There's the House. The House has more members, and then there's the Senate. It parallels the federal system. And so the House has 98 members, and the Senate has 49. You guys might have know that there's an election coming up. You might have gotten the pamphlets in the mail. Currently, Democrats are in charge of both the House and the Senate. There's some questions on whether or not they will be in control after this next election cycle. I feel like they will be, but I'm not. I can't predict the future. But yes, the control of the House can change depending on the year. So our sessions, so the length of the legislative session actually depends on the year. So the session always starts on the second Monday of January. And on odd number years, so like next year, the 2023 session, they're longer sessions. So those are 105 days. And we call those budget sessions because that's when they set the general budget. And so there's a little more like leisure time in these sessions. And then on the even numbered years, there are 60-day sessions. And those are like quick pace sessions. So an odd year plus an even year equals a biennium. And they kind of see like the bienniums as a package together. And so really when you're working on legislation, a bill can pass in either year. But if you introduce a bill in an odd year, so let's say we introduced a bill in the 2023 session, and it didn't make it fully through in 2023, it would kind of like pause, and then it would start in the same spot on the even year. So you kind of have like 2 years almost to pass a bill, although you can work on a bill just in the even number year. But that's just to keep in mind. So an overview of the process of a bill. There are a lot of steps to how a bill becomes law. I'm going to move this actually down here. So the bill has to make it through two chambers. It has to make it through the House of Origin. So that's the House or the chamber where it's introduced. That can be the House or the Senate. And it has to make it through all these steps then. And then it has to go all the way through the same steps in the second chamber. So the first order of business is a bill is introduced. And the way a bill gets introduced is a member of the legislature takes up the bill as an issue that they want to work on. Now, like the back end, how the sausage can get made on that is that there are advocates who really want to see a particular piece of legislation, and they work with a legislator to envision the legislation and then draft the legislation. And then it's the legislator's job to file the bill, to introduce the bill. So the bill has to get introduced. It gets a number. It gets a little like website on the legislature's website. And then once it's introduced, they look at the bill and they think, okay, what's going on with this bill? Like, what's the relevant, like, what's the issue at hand in this bill? And then it's assigned to something called a policy committee. So a policy committee, for the stuff that Look to Justice often works on, those are usually things like the Public Safety Committee or the Law and Justice Committee, sometimes the Reentry Committee, but there's all sorts of different committees. There's committees on transportation, there's committees on youth welfare, there's committees on all sorts of things. And so the bill's assigned to that committee. And then once the bill goes to that committee, the committee chair decides like, okay, I want to have a hearing on this bill. And the hearing is a time where the public can come comment on the bill. So it's a really important time for the bill. because that's when advocacy groups get to weigh in on the piece of legislation, and they'll have public testimony. And you can sign up to speak at these hearings, and it's really important for the committee to hear from folks, to hear about why they support the bill, or in some cases may not support the bill if it's a bill that we're not supportive of. And so then the policy committee hears all of those comments and they consider all those comments, and then they kind of like sit on it for a little bit, and then they call an executive session where the whole committee gets to vote on whether or not the bill moves forward. And then if the bill has implications for the budget of the state, if it's going to cost the state something, it goes to the financial committee. So the Ways and Means Committee or the Appropriations Committee. The committees are like confusingly called different things in the House or the Senate, but it's the same vibe, deals with money. And then there's also another moment where we get public comment. Theoretically, the public's supposed to comment on just how they feel about how this will impact the budget. And then again, the policy committee needs to vote on whether or not to move that bill onward. So again, there's two big steps that you got to get through, and that's just in the House of Origin. And then it goes to something called the Rules Committee. I think of the Rules Committee as like kind of just like a holding tank where they just sort of like chill there and can be discussed. And there are members of the legislature who are on the Rules Committee, and they get to theoretically, we'll talk about this a little bit later, theoretically they get to choose which bills they quote unquote pull from rules. So the bill has to get pulled from rules. And what this means is they say, we want to vote on this bill. We want to take this bill to everyone in this chamber. So like the whole House, we call it the floor, or the whole Senate. And we want all of the legislators in either the House or the Senate to vote on this bill. And so it'll get pulled from rules and it'll go to the floor. And that's when everybody gets to vote. So prior to that, it's just the committee folks that get to vote. But on the floor, everyone gets to vote. There is like some times some time for legislators to make speeches, talk about the bill, debate the bill. It's not really where at the point where the public can weigh in, but it's more for the legislators to debate it. At any point in this process, the bill can be amended. And that means that a legislator can introduce an amendment in the policy committee, in the money committee, on the floor, and say, we want to change the bill to do this. And that amendment can get voted on, and then it'll change the bill. It'll have like a little attachment to be like, this is what the bill is now. Okay, so once the bill makes it through there, may or may not have been amended, it goes to the second chamber, and it does the dance all over again. So there are lots and lots of steps. And if the bill is amended in the second chamber, it has to go back to the first chamber, and the first chamber has to say, yeah, we're good with that amendment, or no, we're not good with that amendment. We have to go to another step where we have to like duke it out, kind of like in like the final rounds when you've got a tie sort of situation. So it's a pretty complicated process, and there are lots of steps. And I think it's important to know that, because, a lot of the issues that, folks that are focused on the criminal punishment system, folks that are focused on, like issues surrounding sex workers, any issues like that, it takes a long any issue, frankly, but especially issues that are more hotly debated, take a long time. And the process is set up to be slow. It's set up to be confusing. It's set up to be kind of frustrating. And it takes on average 6 years to pass a bill. So it's just important to note that. So that was sort of a bit of a side note. But anyway, we get through the chambers. We get through the figuring out whether or not the amendment's okay. Then the governor has to sign it. So it goes from the legislature to the executive to the governor. And the governor has like a few options for it. The governor, right now I'm saying he because it's Governor Inslee, can sign it. Or they can veto it. meaning they're going to say no, even after all that, we went through all that, no. And that would essentially kill the piece of legislation. Or they can kind of just like do nothing. And then after a certain period goes by, then the bill is fine. It goes on. So you also, when in thinking through advocacy, have to think through, do we have the governor on board, or will the governor veto this bill? Because the bill can also, it can also die that way.
And those are all political moves, right? Like even the governor not acting on a bill is a political move. It has implications. And so it's important to see that there's also a reason why they may or may not act on a bill.
Yes, 100%. All of this is like imbued with political moves, right? So the governor, like, you know, they can signal that we don't really support, but we're going to let it pass by sort of like not signing, or like, you know, vetoing, of course, is like a really political move. Or in the signing, you know, if they do like a big public signing and they've got everybody around, you know, they can make a big show of it, right? And so those are all political calculations. And we'll talk about this a few times, but all of the calculations of like the committee chairs, the leadership in like the legislature, those are all political calculations that they're making too. So, you know, if they don't decide to pull a bill and have it get public testimony, or it gets public testimony and then they just let it sit there and die, those are all political moves too. So we think like, oh, it's democratic, like everybody's just going to vote on it, and everybody who's voting on it is voted on, so they're like accountable to their constituents. But that's, you know, you put your finger on, that's not what's really going on. People are making political calculations. And so even though it's frustrating and shouldn't be like that, you know, you have to look at the reality of what is and try to, you know, I always think like survival pending revolution. Like this is our political reality that we're working with. Let's move towards something else. Let's dream bigger, but like let's also understand like what we're working with. So that's a good point. Okay, so if that wasn't enough, going through all of the points that a bill has to go through to become law, there's also deadlines, like hard and fast deadlines that a bill has to make it through on time. And so every year, closer to the start of the legislative session, so that second Monday in January, the legislature will publish something called cutoff deadlines. And the bill has to meet those deadlines or the bill will die. So there's a ton of ways for bills to die. This is a really common one. So for example, let's say like the legislature, the session starts in the second week of January. Within 4 weeks, I'm just making this up, so don't take my word on this. I can send you the calendar once it's published. But in 4 weeks, the bill needs to move out of the policy committee. And then in 6 weeks, it needs to move out of the appropriations or the money committee. And so there's all these deadlines. And so Soo-Young, your point, like political moves, people who are in charge of deciding what bill goes where can kind of hold the bills until the deadline passes and kill them that way, instead of doing like a public show of killing them. And that's all political calculations. You know, maybe they'll look bad if they kill this bill, but they really don't like it, you know?
Mm-hmm. Like letting a bill die seems more neutral than actively putting it down, which might help you keep voters, for example.
Yeah, 100%. And, you know, it's really frustrating because you'll hear from politicians, oh, we didn't have the votes for this. We didn't have, you know, we couldn't. That's like, well, show us, like put it up for a vote and let's see who supports it, who doesn't support it. And then we know, but they have these sort of like back end deals that, you know, we are not privy to as citizens, and they can do it in these like neutral ways. But, you know, nothing is neutral. Everything is calculated. So that's, you know, really important to keep in mind. And yeah, it's really, you know, working with these deadlines is really difficult, especially when you're talking about a 60-day session, you know, on those even years, like making it through in 60 days is super difficult. So when you're thinking about bills, you want to think again about the biennium. So getting a jump on in the odd number a year, for sure. So just to kind of talk a little bit about like the key committees, especially around like law, criminal justice. The first committee is the House Public Safety. So that deals with like policing, sentencing, things like civil commitment, the criminal legal system. And then in the Senate, there's the Senate Law and Justice, and that's both civil and criminal law. And then again, like sentencing, but even family law is like considered in the Law and Justice Committee. So these committees like deal with a broad range of things. And then there's also the Human Services Reentry and Rehabilitation Committee. That's in the Senate. So like the Senate, again, like the Senate and the House aren't like perfectly mirrored, right? So the Senate has like other elements of the criminal justice system sort of like bifurcated. So the Senate Human Services and Reentry, they deal with the juvenile justice system. They deal with like corrections, reentry. They deal with foster care. Actually, in the House, there is a committee that deals with the juvenile justice system too, and like DCYF and like all of those things. So there's different types of committees, but it's important to kind of understand like who's on these committees, like what are their personalities, what's their voting history. Committees are selected at the start of the biennium. And so usually we see people kind of like stay in the same committees, especially if they're reelected. And we especially see like committee chairs usually stick around for a long time, especially like if they continuously get reelected. So we have some of the same committee chairs for a really long time, so you can kind of get to know them, assuming that their party stays in control too, because that will impact who the chair is. So these are the important committees. And then the other key committees, again, are the money committees, because most bills will have to go through the money committees. They'll have to get a thing called a fiscal note. And that really tells us, like, how does this impact the state budget? You know, if it's going to cost the state a lot, people will be, you know, is this worth it? Like, do we have the money? And so you always have to keep that in mind when you're working on a bill. You know, it's really disheartening, but I hear this all the time in my work in Washington, and even I work at the federal level and in other states, but it's always like, I hear, this is really good policy. We don't have the money to do it, you know? And that's just really frustrating because, you know, we think about like, what do we value? What are we invested in? All of the different areas that we could, you know, probably pull money from and put money into things that we know will better our communities, better public safety, heal our communities. But here we are. So you do have to think about money. So when you're thinking about like, I really want this piece of policy, you want to think about how do we find the money or justify the money. And so that's the House Appropriations Committee, the Senate Ways and Means Committee. And then again, the Rules Committee is the place where the bills will be pulled from to the floor. And there are members in the Rules Committee who decide what bills to get pulled, will be pulled to the floor. Now, when we talk a little bit about like who leadership is, we'll talk about what bills get pulled to the floor, like who gets to decide whether or not a bill just sits there, even though it's gone all the way through it's gone all the way through the Policy Committee and the Money Committee, and then it just dies in rules. Like, why don't we vote on it? It has a lot to do with the leadership of either chamber and whether or not they want to pull the bill to the floor. So again, like, we say we're in a democracy, but a lot of like the processes that we're talking about are heavily dependent on like a sole person making decisions, which is, you know, kind of like the antithesis of democracy. So, you know, I always like to name this stuff. It's like so frustrating, you know, like, be with your community, like have self-care, because I don't know if I can cuss on here, but this shit is hard and it's really, really frustrating. So I talked a little bit about like the committees. Now I'm going to talk about the committee chairs, because the chairs, like I said, you have these like kind of figures that in the democratic process get to make the decisions. And the chair really gets to decide like, okay, here's like the plethora of bills that have been assigned to our committees. Which ones do I want to support? Now, theoretically, they'd make those calculations like, okay, I feel like these ones have the best shot. These ones are ones that like we need to get in front of the public and people need to debate, like they make calculations by that. But people are people, and people, have their own priorities. They have their own biases. They have their own preferences. And so a lot of times, like, that chair of the committee is going to have huge implications for what gets selected. So it really is imperative that you get the chair of whatever committee your bill is going to go to on board with you. There are ways to, kind of like public pressure them or like get around them theoretically, but ultimately, like, they, again, not very democratic, but they typically have the ultimate say in whether your bill is going to get through that committee, because they can either just not pull the bill for a vote, they could not hear the bill, or they can like tell the speaker or whoever's in charge of the leadership of that chamber, I don't like this bill, don't pull it. Because ultimately the committee chairs are responsible for pitching their bills and their priorities to the leadership in either the House or the Senate to tell them, hey, these are the bills we want to get through. These are the bills we want to vote on. So again, not very democratic. So in public safety, we have Roger Goodman. He's been the chair for quite some time. He's a legislator out from Kirkland. We have also the Law and Justice. The chair is now Senator Dingra. She was the vice chair for a long time. She's now moved into the chair position. She's from Seattle, or sorry, not from Seattle. She's also in Kirkland, I believe. Should have checked this. Sorry about that. She was is with the King County Prosecutor Attorney's Office. So she has a history as a prosecutor. Representative Goodman also has a history with the criminal legal system. And then the Senate Reentry Committee is now chaired by Senator Wilson. It used to be chaired by Senator Darnielle. She actually just moved to be the assistant secretary of the Women's Prison Division in DOC. So she moved from that to DOC. So now we have Claire Wilson in it.
Chelsea, can committees overrule the chair if they want to get a bill introduced?
What do you mean, like they want the floor to vote on a bill?
Without the chair's approval?
I mean...
Do they really have all that power?
Theoretically, right? Like theoretically, like, but really, like, the way that it works on the back end is that the chair or the leadership relies heavily on the chairs to kind of tell them, we think this is important, we think this has legs. Mm-hmm. So like you could, like, if you have like a really great like sponsor that's like going hard for your bill and you have a lot of community behind it, like you can put pressure in other ways. Mm-hmm. But like, in the back end too, that person holds a lot of power. So it's not a foregone conclusion, at all. Like, and you should always try, right? Like, mm-hmm. always try, but always know that like this is an important figure, and that figure can be an impediment to what you're trying to do. But like it's always important to just be really creative, right? Like, we're working to have Representative Jenkins. She's the leadership in the House. She's the Speaker of the House, right? Like we want her to prioritize criminal legal system reform, sentencing reform. So what we're doing right now is we just issued her a letter with 70 signatures of her constituents. She's up here in Tacoma. She represents Hilltop, which is a neighborhood where there's a lot of folks who have been over-policed and incarcerated. So we had a lot of folks from Hilltop write to her and say, we want you to go inside and we want you to meet with folks who are leaders in prison. And we want you to get to know them. And we want you to hear, their stories, hear their priorities. And we want, to put a face to like the decisions that you're making to not bring our bills for a vote, like our bill that would eliminate the use of juvenile education sat in rules and died, even though it made it out of committee. And so we want accountability. We want, our legislators to hear from us. And so that's a creative way for you to kind of get to know them. And ultimately they can make the decision. Yeah. Is that the question that was in the chat? I'm seeing that there's a...
Yeah, I can bring up the question. It says, someone asked, when bills are passed, approved, and are written into law, whose responsibility is it that these new laws are made known, explained in detail to the general public? Is there even a process for that? I feel like there are a lot of laws that we don't know about until we are made aware of them by someone who just knows, or if we happen to ask if we're allowed to do something or not.
This is such a great question. It's like such an astute observation. And you know what? Like, we're going to spend so much time today talking about how a bill becomes law, but you've hit the nail on the head about something else, is that like a law can be passed. It can be put in the RCW. So you can go to like, wa.leg/RCW and read it. But ultimately, like, there's no accountability mechanisms for one, like the implementation of that law. So a lot of law we have on the books, like we pass, and then if you don't watch it, it might not get implemented. And two, the public probably won't know about it. I think there are some like policy wonks that like watch TVW, religiously, or you're into that. But like for the most part, like, even me, like I don't enjoy reading the RCW. Like that's our like statute. That's the revised code of Washington. It's like difficult to read. So you're absolutely right. There's no process for that. And so a lot of times it falls on the advocates who are working on that. So like one example comes to mind, which is that a couple years ago, this past a couple years ago, there's a huge effort behind it for years. But it restored voting rights to people. So the day that you come out of incarceration, even if you're going to go into community custody or probation or whatever, you're eligible to vote, right? But for decades, people didn't have that right. People came home from prison and they had to wait until they were off paper to vote. And so now it's up to advocates to make a huge push to let folks know that, hey, you now have the right to vote the moment you come out of the gate. Right. But theoretically, if there wasn't that big push, people would just assume, that they didn't have the right to vote. And so like, as you're thinking through all of this, you also have to think through, how do we let folks know? How do we find folks? How do we build community around that? So that's a really great question and point. Okay. So to just add to the layer of like, hey, like our democratic process isn't the most democratic thing you've ever seen. The importance of leadership. So there are two sort of like important figures in the House and in the Senate. And, there's leadership, and those are like you can like Google like House leadership or Senate leadership. And those are like the controlling party. So like, the Dems are in control. So they're all going to be Dems. And those are people that are like trusted to make decisions for the party. Right. And so not only is like House leadership or Senate leadership thinking about like what's good for our state, what do we think is good for our state, like what bills we decide, but it's like, how do we get reelected and how do we continue to gain control, right? And that's going to be a calculation of all the legislators that you're going to work with. Like we'd like to think people get in there and they're like, hey, like we really want to, make a change, like all that. But that may be true, but they also want to continue to be reelected to continue to theoretically make that change. And that's true for the House too. So they're making decisions about whether or not, like if we pass this bill, is there going to be a huge backlash? And then all of a sudden people in what we call purple districts, so those are districts that could swing Dem or Republican, will all of a sudden be like, I'm voting Republican, like this, it's gone too far, right? So they're making those decisions. And House leadership, or not House, but both leadership in each chamber, again, they get to decide, you know what, like, hey, person in the Rules Committee, I want you to pull this bill. And the person in the Rules Committee will pull that bill. So it's not just about like, lobbying folks in the Rules Committee, like, hey, our bill's there, we really like it, will you pull it? They could be like, yeah, but the speaker said no, and I'm not going to go against the speaker, right? So unless you can find like a truly like rogue person, which is harder to find, my dog's barking, sorry about that, then it's going to be difficult. So again, like it's a democratic process that heavily relies on the decision making of like, one or two or three people. And so in that way, it's not a very democratic process. And that's just important to keep in mind. There's one thing I wanted to bring up too. I've talked a lot about passing bills, but it's also important to think about how do we monitor what bills are getting introduced and how do you kill a bill? So the good news is it's a lot easier to kill a bill than to pass a bill. But there are some things like you want to consider. First of all is monitoring. So what I do, and I can show the websites as the end, is you can put sort of alerts on through the Washington State Legislature's website about like what committees are going to be hearing what bills, and you can kind of just look at the bills and you can see like, oh, this is going to be a really bad bill. So many years ago, I worked a lot on sex worker rights bills. And at that time there was, and I still think it's true, a lot of bills that were being introduced that were these like anti-trafficking bills that were really harmful for sex workers, right? They conflated sex work with trafficking, like they further criminalized them. And so what we had to do is we had to monitor those bills. And so I had an alert in the Senate Law and Justice and then in the Public Safety, because I knew the bills would go through there. And I would just look at the bills. And one easy way to kill a bill is like a lot of times like the bills that folks think, oh, this is going to be a shoo-in, right? Like everybody doesn't want people to be sex trafficked, right? Like even though it's like secretly you're just criminalizing folks, or like everybody doesn't want like people, I'm thinking about this because this is at the federal level, but I'll just use an example. Like, we know that there's an issue with fentanyl, right? And so then, well, like nobody likes fentanyl, like we don't want this. And so then they'll be like, well, let's just criminalize it more. That's not what the Washington legislature is trying to do at the moment. Who knows if they would. But like, if you can go in and show, hey, this isn't going to be the slam dunk that you want. So when it is in the policy committee, you and a coalition of folks show up and say, hey, this is bad policy. This is how it's going to impact us. We don't like this. If you can show opposition, especially to those bills that they think is slam dunk, then they're going to get kind of like walk back and think like, you know what, I don't really want to work on this. So like making sure you monitor that and making sure you show up to like the policy committees and really like talk about that. Even showing up when there's public testimony in the money committees and saying like, this is not an effective use of state funding. Like, we don't want to see this. And then just, making it known to your legislators, like whatever district you're in, and then those like committee heads and stuff like this, we don't want to see that. So like you can watch or you can kill bills that way. And it's always great to have like a coalition of folks kind of keeping an eye on. I know that I think No New Washington Prisons sort of did like an anti-criminalization campaign where they watched like new criminalization bills. One thing you want to be careful of when you think about like how do we kill a bill is like making sure that the bill has a chance in the first place. So if it's getting a hearing, then you show up to the hearing. But if you just see a scary bill, like keep an eye on it. You might not necessarily need to like do anything, especially if it's like introduced by someone who like doesn't usually get their bills through. So like, otherwise you might just like, like all the time, and nobody has time for that. So you want to make sure you're like keeping an eye on like the bills that are quote unquote viable and then making a thing. Because again, like we all have way too much on our plates. So I do want to talk a little bit like about the interim and like what you can do during the interim to work on advocacy, to think about like bills that you might want to work on. So the interim is like the time in between the legislative session. And so, the interims can like look differently, especially between like the biennium. So right now we're like in a new biennium. And so you can start thinking about now, like start meeting with your legislators, start meeting with folks that are on the same wavelength as you, and start thinking about like, what do we want to see in the next legislative session? I like to kind of come up with like a proposal, like a one-pager or something like, this is what we want to see. And you can start shopping it around to legislators that you think would be interested in working with you, and start building those connections and seeing if maybe they'd want to sponsor your bill, which means that you would work with them, you'd work with their staff, they'd help draft a bill with you, and then they'd plan to introduce the bill. It's also like a good time to kind of get to know like what the priorities of different legislators are. and just get to know like your individual legislators too. Like, who are they? What do they care about? Are they hearing from their community? Are they hearing from other folks? You know, just like building those relationships and just making yourself known. I think they get some emails, but I don't think people are as engaged as people think. And a lot of time they just don't hear from their constituents. So when I say constituent, I mean, if you live in the legislator's district, like, so you're the one like responsible for voting for them or not. They hear a lot from like advocates, but they don't hear a lot from their constituents all the time. So I would really recommend like getting to know your own legislators and educating them on the issues that care for you. So just thinking again, like how, like it seems daunting, right? Like how do we work on a bill? How do we create a bill? But it's really like, it boils down to like you thinking about what's the issue, like what's going on? What do I want to fix? What do I want to change? What do I want to create? And then thinking about like, does this issue need to be solved at the statute level? Like, so that's to pass a bill and change it, because that's probably like the most difficult. Sometimes it can be changed like in like policy. So if it's like, for example, you know, we work a lot with like, the Department of Corrections, you can change like policy without having to change the statute. But again, if like the policy is not changing and you have to pressure them with statute, with the bill, then, you know, sometimes that's the best option. But thinking through like, do we really need a bill for this? Because again, that's the most difficult way. And if you do, think about like who would be a good champion for the bill in the House and or the Senate. Like, you know, is the person good on your issue? Have they signaled that there is interest in it? Like, do you trust them? Like, you know, all of those things. And you can kind of like, one way that I like to decide like who we might want to work with is looking at a person, like looking at a bill. Like if you have a bill, like, I like this bill, like I'm so glad it passed, or I'm glad like it was introduced, even if it didn't pass, and looking at who sponsored that bill, like who showed up and really like went to bat for this bill in the legislature. You can kind of find sponsorship and allies that way. And then you're going to work with their staff. So a lot of time, like people think like, oh, like I really, like I'm meeting with a staff person, I'm not meeting with the legislator. Sometimes like it's good to meet with the legislator, but ultimately the staffers really know what's up. And they're the ones that are going to be working with you to like write the bill and think through the bill. So getting to know the staffers really well is really helpful too. And they can kind of show you. Again, like talk to your legislators, talk to committee chairs, talk to leadership, like let them know what your priorities are. If you're angry that your priority didn't get through last session and you feel like there needs to be change, like let them know. They need to hear from people, and they need to be held accountable. I'll give this PDF so you guys have it, but there's just some helpful links. Like the ledge.wa.gov site is where all this information is. It is not a pretty site, but it has a lot of information. It has like, you know, all the bill info. It has like a nifty little chart to show you like where a bill is in the process. Like you can find like all the testimony, all that stuff. So it is a helpful site. So I do recommend just sort of like poking around on there. And one cool thing that I guess I don't like to say this, like COVID brought us a cool thing, but one thing that it did bring us is that you can log in now, like in support or against a bill through the website. It used to be you had to be like in Olympia on their Wi-Fi and do it, but now it's more democratic because it's more easily accessible on their website. So like that's a really important just thing to know and a link to have. So that's the end of my presentation. But yeah, if there's any questions or anything.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Chelsea, for giving us that rundown of this process and really kind of, demystifying how exactly these issues get addressed and passed, and also sharing your tips and some of your secrets and tricks with and strategies working with these players. I'd love to end with some questions, if that's okay. I guess the first one is, what do you think are some obstacles that community members might face in trying to advocate for issues that they care about?
Yeah, I mean, I think I've said this like several times throughout the presentation, but like this process is intentionally opaque. right? Like it's made to feel inaccessible. It's made to feel confusing. It's made to feel kind of like elite. And so I think the first barrier is just like naming that and recognizing that, and then like trying to move through and figure out like what ways can we still like align ourselves with our values while participating in this like intentionally like difficult elitist sort of movement. So I think that's difficult. It's really, again, like I obviously don't like COVID. It's been awful, but like there has been some more like accessibility that's come out from COVID. So again, it used to be very much like you needed to take off work. You needed to be able to drive to Olympia. You needed to be able to make these appointments. You needed to be able to like stand up and speak in person for a bill. And so like those are all difficulties that people face in accessing like the legislature, that hopefully with any luck, there's a movement to continue, are going to be a little bit overcome by like continuing to allow remote testimony, normalizing meeting with your legislators over Zoom instead of in person, and allowing people to log in pro or con. So I think there's that. And then the other thing that I would say too is like, so I forgot to mention this, Washington state legislators are part-time legislators. So they have, usually a lot of them have some of them have day jobs. A lot of them are sort of like retired and this is like kind of their only gig, but some of them have day jobs. And so like sometimes accessing your legislators can be difficult. So you also have to be persistent in that. And so like if you don't hear back from them, follow up again. Like my motto is like polite and persistent.
I love that. That kind of leads to our next question. One of the comments from Jill is, can you work with a candidate for a Senate House seat on introducing a bill for the next session?
Yeah, like you can definitely. So I'm guessing like this is a person that has not yet been elected, but like has a good shot at being elected or is currently running. You can absolutely work with those folks. And I think like one effective way to build relationships and to like ensure like that the right folks are getting into those positions is working with candidates and building those relationships with candidates and being like, hey, we really like you. We really support your policies. We really, we support your campaign. Would you be interested in working on this issue if elected? And that kind of signals to them like, hey, we got your back. Like, we're going to go hard for you right now. And then when you get in there, like, we want you to work on this issue. So yeah, I think that's a great strategy. Obviously, like it runs a risk of like they don't get elected, but I don't think that should deter you, right? Like otherwise, we're just like continuing to invest in the same systems that have brought us the same crappy outcomes for a long time. So, yeah.
Thank you for that. What would you change about the system if you could? If Chelsea had almighty power.
I know, right? I'm like, oh, this is being recorded and people can watch this. Burn it to the ground. No, it's like so hard. And I don't know if other folks feel like this. I know this is like not like a therapy space, but you spend so long like working within these systems that were like intentionally designed to be exclusionary, right? Like they were intentionally designed to, uphold white propertied male like wealth, right? Like that's what they were designed to do. Like that's what the systems for how legislation is enacted is designed to do. It's designed to make it hard for real meaningful change to happen. And so like if it were up to me, we would have a completely different system that like collectively in like our communities we dreamed up together that would look a hell of a lot different than this. So my magic wand would wave and this would all change in recognition that, like it's set up for failure from the start. And while we, see wins, like there's not to say we don't see, I'm not trying to be like fatalistic. Like there has been wins that we've seen progress, things have changed, but we can't like always invest in this as like the avenue for change. And I think a lot of folks get invested in that. I don't think probably anyone watching is going to think that. but like, just continuing to like work within your communities, like work within like mutual aid, like doing that important work of organizing and stuff, like continuing that, and hopefully eventually building a world that reflects like that care and that community orientation and a process for decision making and governance that looks like that, instead of this sort of like top down protecting like what was already established.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think a lot of our communities and marginalized communities know that we're ultimately the ones that have to take care of each other. And so when we engage in these systems, we have to be taking care of each other. And then if we have the capacity and ability to, we can send our people to work with these folks in power. Yeah, you spoke a little bit about some of the successes and failures. Could you maybe share some success stories or share some failures that you learned from that have taught you something?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think that, I shared the success story about the voting rights. So like reestablishing voting rights for people as soon as they leave incarceration, which, it's a win, but it doesn't go far enough, right? Like you should not lose a fundamental civil right just because you're incarcerated, and that's a huge issue. So like lots of wins are like these kind of like incremental wins, but we can't stop at that. Like we need to continue going. Another win that we saw is that, so Washington has something called a 3 strikes law. And that means like for a whole host of felonies, if you have 3 of those, you get life without parole. And one of the felonies that was included in there was robbery 2. Many years ago, they removed robbery 2 from that list of felonies, but they didn't make it retroactive. So there are folks sitting inside with a death sentence essentially, who had a conviction that no longer existed in statute. And so a couple of years ago, they made that retroactive. So those folks are being resentenced to new sentences. So that was an important win. But again, like that was for maybe like 60 folks, right? And that's important. And those folks, like, it's great that they have action, but we shouldn't have persistent offender statutes. We shouldn't have 3 strikes law. Like we shouldn't be doing that. And so always thinking about like when we win, like building momentum, but knowing that we're working towards a goal that moves us further. And I guess to bring to the failures, like the bills that I talked about at the start, like we failed in those bills. Like we've been working on those bills for the last couple of years. They haven't passed. But we're going to continue to build power for those bills and recognize that it takes a long time to pass legislation. And a lot of times people say, we're not ready, we're going to lose the votes, like like all of this stuff. But just continuing to advocate and to take care of each other. That's how you get a win.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. Thank you. I have a question from YouTube on the chat. How would advocacy look different if a harmful bill has passed compared to advocacy when the bill is at the policy committee?
Yeah. So if the bill, like, I'm going to assume it's just like the bill is signed into law. Yeah. So like if the bill, or I guess there's one thing you could say, if the bill passes through like both chambers, and then you can advocate to the governor to veto it, right? So that's one thing. And then if it passes, the advocacy looks like you have to pass a bill to remove that statute. And so you have to think through that. So really it's like, if you can get it at the policy level, if you can get it on the floor, if you can get it at the, I worked on a bill in a different state. We got the governor to veto it ultimately. That's really important. But yeah, you'd have to pass another bill to remove it. Again, like it's slow change here.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, for sure. I guess our final question would be just any advice or encouraging words for someone who is new to this kind of work. We have a lot of youth who are interested in getting involved in advocacy. Any encouraging advice or wisdom that you'd like to share with folks watching and folks who will see this if they want to get involved in this work?
Yeah, totally. I mean, I think the youth, I get to teach the youth in my job. And I just think we need new blood. Like, we need new blood in these movements. We need your expertise. We need your energy. We need your like dreaming big and your big ideas. And so like, don't be shy when you get in these spaces. Like, don't feel like you have to like conform into what you think like a lobbyist looks like, or an advocate working at the legislature. Like, be you and bring that passion. And like, don't let them wear you out, you know, like take care of yourself, but like, just understand that like, when you move into these systems, like it is a constant battle not to become subsumed into these systems and believe in these systems. So like, keep that energy, keep that advocacy, and like that newness, that noviceness, like that is where your power lies, because you're going to think of new things because you're coming at it from a new angle. And so like, don't be intimidated, like bring that energy. It's going to benefit everyone.
Love that. Love that. Wow. Chelsea, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom with our community regarding political advocacy. Thank you so much, audience, for tuning in. If you'd like to get involved, please shoot me an email at suyoung@utopiawa.org. If you'd like to learn more about Chelsea's organization, it's look2justice.org, look2justice.org. And just finally, we'd like to remind folks to register to vote. You can do that at votewa.gov in order to get these folks that we've talked about elected. It really does depend on you, and you as a constituent really do determine who are in these seats. The general election is Tuesday, November 8th. And with that, I'd like to wish everyone a great evening. Thank you for tuning in.